This week's workshop questions are about consumer choice. And in particular, what they're about really is showing how a particular theory in economics called a neoclassical theory of consumer choice works. And what we're going to do is look at it from two perspectives, an old and a new perspective. When I say new, I mean the new perspective was developed in the 1930s, so it's not that new. But anyway, so the first perspective is based on the idea that a consumer will attempt to maximize their total level of happiness, or what they call utility. So they have a goal of attempting to maximize their utility, and what we'll look at is the theoretical mechanism by which that would be worked out. Now, that particular idea was premised on the notion that this utility was a quantity, and a measurable quantity that you could count, in some sense, the amount of happiness that someone would experience by, say, eating an apple or eating a Mars bar or eating a combination of the two, or that sort of thing. We'll then look at, and that was called a cardinal utility approach. What we'll look at after that in part 2 is what's called the ordinal utility approach. And that jettisons the idea that you can, or that you really need to, be able to measure utility. Utility takes on a new meaning here. It doesn't necessarily mean, happiness or pleasure. Sometimes the word satisfaction is used, but really we're getting rid of, or the theory attempts to get rid of, pretty much all the psychological content as much as it can, and leaves us with simply preferences. I prefer this over that, rather than saying I get this much more happiness from this compared to that. So we're simply, in the new approach, simply ranking options that are available to us in order. That's why it's called ordinal, rather than being able to measure in some way quantities of satisfaction or happiness or pleasure from these quantities of goods. All right, so that's pretty much that. So now we'll look at part 1, cardinal, and then part 2, ordinal. All right, so let's look at some key assumptions that underlie the understanding of the consumer, or the theorization of the consumer in their decision making. And our question here is, what do the following italicized words mean? So our first assumption is that consumers, or the buyers of some good, have a single goal in mind. They're singular-minded in the sense that they seek to maximize their total utility. This is their only goal in life. What do we mean by total utility? First, what's utility? Utility here means happiness or satisfaction. That we're doing cardinal analysis, so it means that happiness or satisfaction can be measured objectively. It's a quantity. And we're interested in the total utility, that is, the total amount of happiness that a person would experience by consuming some quantity of a good, or some quantity of a combination of different goods, a bundle of goods. We also assume that the consumers experience marginal utility from each additional unit of a good used. So this is pretty straightforward. Marginal utility. Marginal means additional or extra. So we're talking about the extra or additional happiness or satisfaction that a consumer receives from an additional unit of a good, or an additional increment of some good or other. So the first slice of pizza gives you some amount of happiness. That's the marginal utility of that first slice. The second slice of pizza gives you some amount of happiness or satisfaction as well. That's the marginal utility of the second unit, and so on. Third, we assume that the consumers are subject to the psychological law of diminishing marginal utility. So this means that for each additional unit or small increment of a good that someone consumes, they derive less and less extra happiness from those increments. The first slice of pizza gives you some amount of happiness. Right? That's the marginal utility. The second slice gives you less happiness or satisfaction than the first slice. The third slice gives you less happiness or satisfaction than the second slice, and so on and so forth. The marginal utility from each additional slice of pizza is diminishing, and we call this a law because we're going to assume that it applies to pretty much all goods that you would be interested in consuming. Obviously, that's not necessarily going to be the case, but nonetheless, we're going to say that this law of diminishing marginal utility applies in most instances, and certainly what we're going to look at next. And fourth, that consumers are capable of figuring out the combinations of goods that they can afford. They have that cognitive capacity to figure that out. And this implicitly indicates that the buyer has a limited budget, a limited amount of money at their disposal to spend on goods and services. And furthermore, that the goods and services that they might want have prices that are greater than zero. All right, now you might say, well, this is going to be pretty easy. All we have to do is think about how much happiness that a person gets from each additional slice of pizza or whatever, and you just add it up, and you get the total amount of happiness. Once they've spent all their money on pizza, then they've reached their maximum amount of happiness. Well, not so fast. Let's say we've got two goods that you might want to consider choosing between. Let's say it's a music, you're thinking about going to a concert or going down the shop and buying a Mars bar. Now let's say the concert gives you 100 units of happiness or satisfaction, whereas the Mars bar gives you only 20 units of satisfaction or happiness. You might say, well, this is a no-brainer. I'm going to go to the music concert because you get more happiness from it. Well, that would be an incorrect way to think about it, because what you really need to do is think about not just the amount of happiness you would get from a unit of concert or a unit of a Mars bar, but how much you had to pay to get that happiness. So we need to think in terms of marginal utility relative to the price of the product. Or in other words, what it boils down to is marginal utility per dollar. It's how much bang for your buck do you get. Now if we compare the two options, we can see that we get a very different outcome. Although the concert gives you much more happiness, 100 units of happiness, the price is $50 to get it. So you would be effectively receiving 2 units of happiness per dollar if you simplified this ratio. Whereas on the other hand, for the Mars bar, you get 20 units of happiness, less than the concert, but it only costs you $2 to get the 20 units of happiness. In effect, from this Mars bar, you're getting 10 units of happiness per dollar. Which would you prefer? 2 units of happiness per dollar or 10 units of happiness per dollar? If what you're interested in, remember our goal is happiness, satisfaction, then the rational consumer is going to go for the Mars bar every day of the week. Alright, so that's for the first unit of A and B. This doesn't just help us figure out which good we should consume, but how much of each good we consume, or the consumption bundle. What's in our basket of goods that make us happy overall? Let's go to the second unit of B. Now remember, for the second unit, our law of diminishing marginal utility is in place. So the second unit of a Mars bar, the second Mars bar, doesn't give us as much happiness as the first one. Which one should we choose now, the concert or the Mars bar? Well, it's still the case that the Mars bar gives us more happiness per dollar. The concert gives us 2 units of happiness, or 2 units of satisfaction per dollar. What about the second Mars bar? Well, the second Mars bar, due to the law of diminishing marginal returns, now gives us only 12 units of happiness, but we only had to pay $2 for it. So we're effectively getting 6 units of happiness per dollar. The second Mars bar is still a better deal than the concert. So let's go on. We've still got some money left over, let's say. So we go to the third Mars bar. The third Mars bar, according to the law of diminishing marginal utility, gives us less happiness than the second one. 8 units of happiness. Is it still a better deal than the concert? Well, yes. Concert's 2 units of happiness per dollar. The third Mars bar is giving us 4 units of happiness per dollar. It's still a better deal. So, with the money we've still got left over, let's buy another Mars bar. Alright, the fourth Mars bar gives us less happiness than the second. So, the marginal utility from the fourth Mars bar is 4 units of happiness. Okay, which is better now? In this case, we can see they are equally good value, so to speak. The amount of happiness you get per dollar is identical for 1 concert and 4 Mars bars. So in this case, we're now indifferent between the two. If we've got enough money, we'll now purchase both of these products. Okay? Because they give the same amount of happiness per dollar. If we now generalize this kind of reasoning that we've been looking at, we can obtain a utility maximization rule. And the utility maximization rule is simply saying that a consumer will keep purchasing quantities of goods, A, B, C, however many there are, up to the point where the marginal utility per dollar, or in other words, the marginal utility of the last unit consumed of each relative to the price of each is equal, like we saw back here, until the entire budget is exhausted. That is, when all of your money is spent. That's our utility maximization rule, where the marginal utility per dollar is equal amongst all of the goods that we want to consume, up to the point where our budget is spent. Let's now look at a 2 good case where we've got Mars bars and Snickers. We're going to assume the price of Mars bars is $2 and the price of Snickers is $4, and we've got a budget of $16. What is the utility maximizing combination of Mars bars and Snickers that the consumer can afford? So let's look at the table. Here we've got, in the first column, we've got the quantities, and second column we've got the marginal utility of Mars bars. So the happiness or satisfaction you get from each additional Mars bar. We've got the price of the Mars bars here. Now what we want to do is first we want to calculate the bang for your buck. That is, the marginal utility per dollar that we would get. And we find that by dividing the marginal utility of each Mars bar, each additional Mars bar, by the price of the Mars bars. Voila! So we've got the marginal utility per dollar here for Mars bars. Now we need to do it for Snickers. Here's the marginal utility from each bar of Snickers, from the 1st down to the 8th, and the price of the Snickers is $4 each. Now we need to calculate the marginal utility per dollar for Snickers. And we can see, because the price, we can see that the marginal utility from both Mars bars and Snickers is the same for every quantity. Because Snickers are more expensive, the amount of happiness you get per dollar is less compared to Mars bars. Alright, now we need to make our choices. Which is the best value for money? Well, the first Mars bar gives you the most happiness per dollar, so that you'll choose that first. What's the next best value? The second Mars bar gives you 9 units of happiness per dollar. It's better than any other combination, any other quantity here. And the third, fourth, fifth, they all give more happiness per dollar. So far, so good. Should we stop there? How much money have we spent? Well, we will have purchased 5 Mars bars for $2 each. So we will have spent $10 of our budget. But our budget was $16, so we've still got some money to spend. Let's go see if we can buy some more. What's the next combination? What's the next good we would purchase? That is, which one has the next highest marginal utility per dollar? Well, we can see here it's both of these the same time. The 6th Mars bar gives you 5 units of happiness per dollar, and the first Snickers gives you 5 units of happiness per dollar. Well, so in that case, we'd want really to buy both of them, because we're indifferent between them. And if we can afford it, we would choose both of them. Can we afford it? Well, we've spent $10 already. Can we afford to buy an extra Mars bar and a Snickers? Well, an extra Mars bar will be $2, and we're buying a Snickers for $4. So we're spending, by buying the 6th Mars bar and the first Snickers, we're spending $4 plus $2, $6 in total. Alright, so we've already spent 10, now we're going to spend 6. That's our whole budget. We can't buy more than that. And we've purchased up to a point where the marginal utility per dollar is the same for the two goods. Now, obviously, that's not just a coincidence. I've constructed the example so that we get this outcome. But it's to illustrate the point. What if the price of Mars bars goes up from $2 to $4? What combination will be chosen now? So back to our table. Except now we've put the price of Mars bars up from $2 to $4. That means we've got to recalculate the marginal utility per dollar for the Mars bars. We don't need to do it for the Snickers, nothing's changed there. So we recalculate. Marginal utility per dollar, 20 over $4, 18 over $4, 16 over $4, and so on. And here we've got our marginal utility per dollar. So surprise, surprise, the marginal utility per dollar for Mars bars is now exactly the same as the marginal utility for Snickers at every quantity. Alright, so what combination should we buy? Which ones give us the most happiness per dollar? Well, 5 units of happiness per dollar for both the first Mars bar and the first Snickers. 4.5 units of happiness per dollar for both for the second Mars bar and the second Snickers. Should we keep going? Well, what was our budget? $16. We've purchased 2 Mars bars for $4, so that's $8 spent on Mars bars, and we've purchased 2 Snickers which are $4 each. So that's $8. So we spent $8 on Mars bars and $8 on Snickers. That's the $16 spent. So when the price of Mars bars went up to $4, we had to change the combination of Snickers and Mars bars that we purchase in order to make sure we're getting bang for our buck and we're spending all of our budget. So you can see it's changed the quantities that would be chosen by changing the price of one of the products. And you can do the same if you change the price of the other product as well. It'll give you another combination. But we now have enough data to draw a demand curve for Mars bars. So when the price was $2, you'll remember we figured out that the quantity of Mars bars demanded was 6. However, when assuming nothing else changed, when the price of Mars bars went up to $4, we figured out that the quantity demanded by our consumer was only 2 Mars bars. We've got our 2 data points now that we need to at least notionally draw a demand curve. So at the price of $4, 2 units will be consumed or demanded, and at the price of $2, 6 Mars bars will be demanded. Join the dots. Voila! We have a demand curve for Mars bars. Exciting, isn't it?